Good morning, crime community. If you've been following my stream at all, I've been talking about facsimiles. It's a little bit confusing because there's so many publishers and printers. You end up with a book that you can't read, or it's an original facsimile that wasn't printed properly, or the book afterwards didn't get cut at the bottom of the pages. Though this is a decent facsimile, it's probably not one of the original works because this poetry was published around 1850 or something, and this is published in 1927, which is still old. But I was talking about Mrs. Sedgwick and Mrs. Edgewood. Mrs. Edgewood is from America, and Mrs. Sedgwick is from England. So the two of them were like contemporaries. And there was so much competition between the two of them because the English were kind of arrogant to the Americans because they thought they didn't have the standards of literary technology that they had. So we'll eventually on this stream we will discuss Edgewood and Sedgwick and see how they communicated together. That's off for a few days. So today I'm just going to read some Keats, and we're just going to try to learn about Keats. This is from the introduction. His own best criticism of the slipshod Endymion, as he called it, was the great fragment Hyperion, which now took form under pressure of the outward afflictions and inward developments summarized above. In this poem, Keats is brooding further upon the revelation between the higher and lower kinds of beauty in the faith that both manifest a single great power. But here the two kinds instead are merging together fluently in the Endymion, come into serious conflict. The gorgeous but primitive beauty of the Titan Hyperion has to give place in the loveliness of the newborn of Apollo. The young god of poetry, however, must undergo a mystic preparatory change marked by agony and an influx of large knowledge, Book 3. The incomplete episode, deeply rooted in Keats' own experience, adumbrates the condition that brought the work to a standstill. His power was not yet equal to his intent. His own Apollonic transformation was incomplete, but the first two books of Hyperion reach a level of epic vision and manner beyond any other English poem since Paradise Lost. Lacking the ethic profundity and surging strength of Milton, the fragment has a value of its own, a serene but warmly beauty rising through the dark changingful of life and opposing to a malignant hour, ethereal presence. Such presence came to Keats as he worked on the poems beside his dying brother. There was an awful warmth about my heart, like a load of immortality, my solitude of sublime. I feel more and more every day as my imagination strengthens that I do not live in this world alone, but in 1,000 worlds. Shapes of epic greatness are stationed around me. He wrote also, my greatest elevations of soul leave me every time more humble, and hence more presently came to undervalue Hyperion, extremely fancying it too factitious. Turning to a humbler theme, he composed swiftly the most accomplished narrative, the Eve of St. Agnes, in a frame of cold moonlight and argent reveille. The romantic love scene is conjured up, stroked upon stroke, with glowing hand, reaching a magic fullness and then fading magically away. No doubt this poem was indirectly inspired by Keats' engagement to Miss Fanny Braun, whom he met in Hampstead in the last months of 1818. She was a vivacious girl of 19, fond of social pleasures, capable of solitude and of good reading, and apparently quite worthy of him in spite of his disparaging comments by his two hero-worshipping friends. He had some enlightenment experiences of his young woman, and his sound sense of well as his sentiment drew him to Miss Braun. On the surface, he was subject to fits of mawkish jealousy and yearning that found primate utterance in his letters and poems to her. These moods were escapes of his temperament under pressure of his heaping perplexities. In 1819, poverty became imminent, and the marriage was a distant prospect. His longing for it at once enjoyed and hindered a steady concentration of his literary labors. The divided mood appears in the bright star sonnet with its droop to soft bathos after the steady beauty of the first 9 lines, but these lines are from the center of his being. They shape out a North Star image that has been in his mind since the previous June, an image of his steadfast devotion to the great power. The devotion was active now, even while his art was lying fallow during the period beyond by the Eve of St. Mark and La Belle Dame, two delicately modulated sequels of the Eve of St. Agnes. In this interval, he was trying, in the service of beauty, to face and transcend the trials that came to him. This effort is variously reflected in the sonnets of the time and comes out clearly in his letters. In the middle of March, he writes to his brother George, "Nothing ever becomes real till it is experienced." And in the end of April, "Call the world, if you please, the value of soul making. Do you not see how necessary a world of pain and troubles is to school and intelligence and to make it a soul? A place where the heart must feel and suffer in 1,000 diverse ways." He was thus preparing himself unconsciously for the great odes of May in the Greccan urn, in Melancholy, to a Nightingale, with their September sequel, the Ode to Autumn. These 4 poems, read in succession, give a pastoral vista of life, and passing joys and sorrows are heard in meadow and forest, along the slopes and streams, in daylight and brooding darkness, in the chill rains of springtime, and around the warm stubble panes of fall. The scene of intimate and poignant, yet the poet views it all at a little distance with a half smile and molds it with the firm clearness of sculpture. He may find here the lines are all to agitations, but these are not felt as personal to him. They have been shaped in the magic casements opening in wonderful seas, and above them rises a certain peaceful citadel. The poem of Indolence, a piece of playful and dreamy aftermath, suggests that the state of exhaustion brought on by the great odes, in them Keats' lyrics work came to a climax, and his mind was turning again to narrative poetry. To concentrate upon this, he abstended himself from Hampstead and his fiancée from June 27th to October 10th, lodging first at Shanklin in the Isle of Wight and then in the old city of Winchester. The 3 pieces are now occupied him. Lamia, Otho the Great, and the Fall of Hyperion stand in remarkable contrast to one another. His scope was widening with consequent uncertainty as to the main path ahead. Otho, in which the scenario was provided by his friend Brown, was designed for the stage and had some real dramatic quality, like its fragmentary sequel, King Stephen. As soon as the poet saw that his proper milieu was not, for the present at least, the formal drama, at the opposite pole was his abortive attempt at the poetry of symbolically vision in the full of Hyperion. Here he rejecting the epic mode of the original Hyperion, but retaining the chief episodes of the story, he tried to merge them into the matrix of Dominesque dream, and the beginning of the idea of an Apollonic transformation carried over from the close of Hyperion is now applied directly to the case of the poet himself. Urged by a deep sense of human misery, he seemed to need of undergoing a sort of death and rebirth overseen by the goddess of creative memory, Manteca, and soon personage of Menonopse in the original version, but far more austerely conceived. Here then more poignant than ever in Keats' sense of the difficult intervals between the poetry of epic thought and the poetry of romantic pleasure, symbolized by the feast of summer fruits, such a summer feast as Lamia, Keats' last great poem, but throughout it goes a strain of autumnal music, as fearful as the whole charm might fade, sharper in touch and cooler in spirit than Isabella and the Eve of St. Agnes. Lamia is a brilliant culmination of Keats' work in the romantic tale. The genre now seems to him too facile. Settled again in Wentworth Place, Hempstead, he was searching perplexedly for a form that would bring into concert all of his diverse powers, and wisely he inclined into a more or less historical subject, in particular the story of Queen Elizabeth, Earl of Leicester, several years before the appearance of Scott's Killenworth. Such a poem could be dramatic without being drama, and provide scope of his humorous observation and his deeper vision of life without being either trivial or visionary. He would be at home amongst men and women, and he suggested in a letter of November 17th for the romantic coloring, so consummate of his legendary tales, would now be diffused throughout a poem in which the character and sentiment would be the figures into such drapery. The sort of poetry was normally ahead of Keats after a long period of incubation, but the extraordinary labor of the past 12 months, in addition to draining his creative powers, has fastened upon him tuberculosis of the throat and lungs. Not understanding his own condition and subjected more than ever to the cravings of his love, he became the prey of restless despair. He tried to continue the fall of Hyperion, turned presently to the amusing Cap and Bells by way of relief, and fell to revising old poems at the close of the year. On February 3rd, 1820, came his first hemorrhage. His sturdy frame continued to resist the disease month after month, but the medical ignorance of the time aggravated his sufferings and sealed his fate. He recovered enough to enjoy the commonest flowers of the English spring and with new wonder, and to prepare for the press his third and chief volume. It wrung from the reviews of a recognition which could bring him now only a languid pleasure. His chief comfort was the devotion of Miss Braun when, after further hemorrhages, he was taken into her household in August for nursing. The next month, on mistaken advice of his doctors, he sailed for Italy, attended only by his devoted friend Severn. His leaving Miss Braun behind was a good deal through his kindness for me, she recorded later, for he foresaw what would happen. On board ship off the south coast of England, he could see her figure eternally vanishing in darkness, as this time he wrote down in a copy of Shakespeare the final version of the British Star Sonnet. During the miseries of the voyage to Naples and the longing housing days in Rome, many words of torture broke from him, but towards the end he was calm and firm, records Severn, to the most astonishing degree. He sent his friend to see what flowers were growing in the Protestant cemetery where his body was to be buried. In the night of February 23rd, 1821, in Severn's words, he gradually sank into death, so quiet that I still thought he was slept. For us, his poetry is hung aloft the night, and it shines on our way ahead. In reading it, we know that his brief life was profound in its joys and in its sorrows, and that his incomplete work has a completeness of its own. From everything that came to his hand and drew quick fruit of delight, for he worshipped the unseen life of truth and beauty beyond the harvest of sense. He listened always for melodies that elude the sensual ear, and deep suggestions of the spirit are caught in the warmth magic of his phrasings. The reader who listens incessantly at these soft pipes plays on will become aware of the richer inward harmony than is heard than any other poet of the past 100 years. The others of maturer poems, but not his magnanimity of poetic contemplation. His work has an aura of a universal mode of art that the modern age longed for and still longs for, and in the midst of its complex preoccupation with singular interest, I think poetry should surprise by a fine excess and not by singularity, wrote Keats on February 27th, 1818. I should strike the reader as a wording of his own highest thoughts and appear almost as remembrance. Presently, the ode of Maya, he repeated this thought that he prayed the goddess of verse that would be rich in the simplest worship of the day. G.R. Eliot. That concludes the introduction to Mr. Keats. I'm going to be reading more introductions in the coming days from Miss Sedgwick and Miss Edgewood as I get the facsimiles or non-facsimiles in the mail. We will continue to study these poets and how these two women became so involved with each other that they were actual contemporaries. It's a very interesting story between the two English and British, the American and British poem. So we will study these in the days to come. And if there's any truth to what I'm doing here, have a nice day.